You know, being a journalist, one of the most difficult moments for me was when I had this conversation with children. And quite frankly, recently, May 27th, I had this conversation with children from across the continent, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria. And one thing stood out from all that they said on the day. They want the government to give them better infrastructure, better education. And they're asking for all of these things because of one thing that has become a big problem: corruption. That's the focus today on The Square, talking about Africa's fight against the monster called corruption. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. Well, corruption is endemic in Africa, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where graft, money laundering, and other forms of corruption are endemic. Now, in Transparency International's 2020 report on corruption, sub-Saharan Africa scored the lowest percentage points owing to the rampant presence of corruption-related matters. Now, Kenya, one of the continent's best economies and a giant in the East African community, also faces these challenges. Now, the public procurement sector in Kenya has the highest number of graft cases in the country. It is often at the center of major corruption scandals in the country and has been a tough nut to crack for successive governments. Now, the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission of Kenya is responsible for the prosecution of corruption actors and is seen as a major force in battling this practice in the country. We continue our conversation on the fight against corruption today on The Square. Joining me now is Professor Gitile Naituli, his former Commissioner, National Cohesion and Integration Commission, Kenya, and Paul Banoba, Africa Regional Advisor from Berlin. Pretty much later, Daniel Bwala, lawyer and member of Lincoln's Inn, London, will be joining us from the United Kingdom. Gentlemen, good to have you here on The Square. Let me start with you, Professor Naituli. You've worked in a capacity where you've seen the reaction of the Kenyan people, to corruption. What strikes you the most, about the presence of corruption in your country?
Well, what surprised me is when we changed the government in 2002, the citizens were very sure that we will put the corruption behind us. They were ready to fight it. But when senior officials in the government went right back into corruption, the citizens gave up. Now that strikes me as strange because people are not supposed to give up. They are supposed to intensify the war against the corruption, against greed, against the lack of patriotism, against the lack of nationalism, because that's what corruption is. So that is a surprise that people actually gave up, and it's going on now as normal.
When I talk to people across the continent, there's something peculiar about the African continent, and it is the similarities of the problems they're dealing with. Now, listening to you, Professor Naituli, I think every Nigerian watching this moment will say, hey, I thought that was about Nigeria. But we'll come back to you so that we can expatiate more. So quickly, let me go to Berlin, where Paul Banoba is. Paul, in what ways do you think corruption has affected Kenya and Kenyans' progress, especially listening to Professor Naituli? It would seem as if, there are not much difference. Do you think what do you think is the difference in approach between foreign and perceptively less corrupt countries and African countries?
Thank you so much, Sulaiman. Two things. The first is that corruption is, as we understand it, a society problem. And it affects every part of society. It really does not leave out any. And the solutions must also come from the society's understanding of their problem and crafting appropriate solutions. So to the extent to which it's a society problem, there are different societies, and those societies, their differences will mean that corruption has a particular flavor in each of the societies. In some of our Latin American contexts, it will be very heavily connected to organized crime. In some of our politics in Africa, it will have a particular connection to politics. So the way the society is organized will have a characteristic that therefore corruption manifests itself in the way that society runs its affairs. But also to say that in a number of our African countries, when you hear the scandals that are going on and the failures to address particular problems, there's a thread that cuts across. So there are a number of similarities, especially in Africa.
You know, Professor Naituli, it's, I think, just okay, you're going to react to that. I saw you raise your hand. Go ahead.
Yes. And I'm glad that he mentioned the Southern America, because there is one defining feature of corruption. The countries that opened their democratic process so that anybody can be president, like the US, the difference between South America and North America, is that somebody like Abraham Lincoln was able to be president, abolished slavery. A single mother child like Obama was able to be president, a crazy fellow like the one they just revoked. South America is a dynastic rule. So dynasties maintain political hegemony by political and economic hegemony by impoverishing the general population. The way you impoverish the general population is to make corruption a culture. So Africa is moving in the direction of South American states. It's not moving in the direction of Europe or North America. And that is a tragedy, because only people who hate themselves and hate their countries would do some of the things that we do.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a soundbite, a very deep statement, and it is only for someone who's truly not bothered that will take it on the surface. Now, let's dig in deep, Professor Naituli. I'll come back to you, Paul. And it has to do with my conversation with children, marking Children's Day, May 27th. And it would amaze you. I had this conversation with 7 children from across the continent on the show. And some were from South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria. And do you know what? They're also as bothered and worried as us parents. So it tells you how deep this is. So now, digging deep and looking at governments that have come in, as you know, in your opening, comment, every time an African is hoping that there is an end in sight, it turns out, the other way. What are those things you think Africans are not getting right when it comes to, electing people who can actually push, at least to get the countries or the continent out of huge corruption, even if they can't eradicate it totally?
You see, the unfortunate thing in this continent is that corruption is actually official. It's in government policy. And that's why it's so difficult to remove. Because you see, if you get a Magufuli style of leader than just a Tanzanian president, for example, you can finish corruption tomorrow. But now it has become a culture. We are living a culture. How do you remove a culture? You must get patriotic officials. You have to remove an entrenched endemic culture from the top down, not any other way. So now, what is the damage when it's our culture? The damage is the citizens. Relax. They start appreciating the crooks, the thieves. When the thieves reorganize to win the next election, for example, the citizens, the young people, the children you are talking about, whose lives are being stolen by corruption, they supported them. And they voted for them again. That's the unfortunate thing when corruption becomes a culture. So in most African countries, it is a culture. So we need a cultural revolution, like Chairman Mao's the great leap forward, when Chairman Mao declared that within 10 years, China will feed itself, it defend itself. So we need that approach from an African leader in any of these countries to insist that in this year, from January to December, there will be no single case of corruption, because we will be getting rid of all the corrupt people, and now that person has to be clean, has to be believable, and then corruption will end. So as it is now, it's our culture, we are living in the culture, we are stealing the future of our children, and that is quite okay.
Well, I think some, frank, comment from you, Professor Naituli. Paul, I saw you nodding your head there, because the problem now is, how do you change a bad culture if what he's highlighted as being a culture is what we're trying to uproot from the continent?
You change that by...
sorry, Professor Naituli, I wanted Paul to react to this. I'll come back to you.
I completely agree with Professor Naituli there. The idea that this is entrenched, where a society is facing entrenched corruption, it affects so many sectors. And the problem then becomes, how do you change that at once? You cannot fire the entire civil service. Of course, this has been tried in a few places a few years ago, but the resources to replace an entire public service, for example, it's just phenomenal. And if the society is facing endemic corruption entrenched, it is not just the public service, because it's also in the business sector, it's in the civil society, it's in the society, sometimes all the way to religious institutions. So you wouldn't have a solution that removes all the corrupt, identified as corrupt elements or suspected as corrupt elements in the individuals holding offices all at once. It's just not possible. What is possible, on the other hand, connects what you mentioned with the Children's Day, May 27th, that one can hope that the future generation can actually then be sensitized about the nature of the problem, so that they come up seeing role models, seeing what is possible to change, and having the hope to address it. And that is really difficult.
Because I think, Paul, you've just hit it on the head, because you'll be amazed when I pose the questions to our children on the day, asking them what bothers them the most. And these are people from across the continent, not in the same location. And some of them said, bad roads. I don't like it when my mom, takes me to school through a bad road. And another said the same thing, and another said the same thing. And this is because of corruption. So, Professor Naituli, how does one, look at, or rather, how does the continuous presence of corruption affect cohesion and integration of Africans?
It really affects cohesion greatly, affects integration greatly, because cohesion is driven by people having a common agenda, getting together, feeling the government serves them fairly. Now, the way corruption works is, we are different nationalities in Africa. Very few countries are nations. Most countries in Africa are actually that countries. There is a difference between a country and a nation. A nation is a cohesive entity. So what you find is Africa has countries made of many nationalities. So when some nationality within a country take power, the people who do corruption are mainly from that particular ethnic community. The others are excluded from it. That increases that increases resentment, both for the government and the community which they assume is eating. Because what is eating is actually relatives, political friends of the person in power from that community, but not that particular community. So it has a serious impact on cohesion, but more so, serious impact on the government ability to deliver medical care, government ability to deliver quality education, because most of the money goes to corruption. So it's not possible for the government, for the state, to do what it's supposed to do, take care of its people. Now, you may ask, how did this thing start? When you look at the history of colonialism, you realize there was a revolution engineered in Africa. Every society has an underclass. In Africa, it is the underclass which went to the Europeans. It is the underclass which became Christian or Muslims. It is the underclass which got education. It is the underclass that took power. These are the people already with a lot of hatred for themselves. And they have translated that hatred to the entire society because these people still rule, still manage these countries. Because the independence, quote unquote, it never really percolated to the Mandelas of this world, to Nyereres of this world, to Captain Sankaras of this world. It never did. That is the struggle for Africa, to reclaim itself and then save itself from the revolution which was engineered, social revolution engineered by the Europeans. So we are basically people of low consciousness. But those people of low consciousness are sitting on top of the most countries in Africa, and they are the grandfathers and grandmothers of corruption.
I think
because they have no love for themselves or their countries.
Yeah, Professor Naituli, I'll come back to you because you just called some great, Africans, and some of the conversations, I've had with some other Africans is how come some of these great minds, don't stay too long, with people on the continent. A while ago, you also mentioned John Magufuli, who actually started pretty well. Too bad. That's a big loss to the continent. But we'll come back to you, Professor Naituli. Let me quickly get to Paul in Berlin. Paul, listening to Professor Naituli, I want to ask how best you think corruption can be reduced, to the minimum in Africa. Is that possible? Are there ways you've been able to explore, that you would want to share with the continent?
Thank you, Sulaiman. I think your question actually helps us reflect on what is possible, what can be done. One way to look at it is who has been able to make a dent, however slight, who has been able to make a dent in the corruption situation in their country in the last few years. So that's a good place to start and look and see, can we draw lessons from there? What did they do? What did they get right? And reflecting on that, I think Prof may also agree with me, we do not have leaders that come into office explaining to people that we have come to take the resources as much as possible towards ourselves and our communities and even those communities that are divided, even along ethnic lines. The leaders that come to office do not in advance advertise that they have come to drain the national resources. Instead, on the contrary, they come in saying, we are going to root out the problem of corruption, we are going to change everything, and it's on these premises that society votes them into office. And as you also mentioned, Sulaiman, they start off quite well. A number of them start off quite well. So what is likely to make a difference is a cautious a society that has the consciousness to actually hold the leaders to account. If you came in promising us heaven and earth, as soon as you get into office, could we task you with explaining your agenda, laying it out? If there are laws that need to be changed, could civil society, religious leaders, could everybody play a role in reminding the leaders what it is that they promised and hold them to that promise and hold them accountable. If we have a society that can continuously do that and very consistently, that will actually make a dent. And we have seen this work in some places. I will mention one of the countries that is currently showing considerable progress in the fight against corruption is Angola. And what we are also seeing in Angola, also in the Angolan press, is that the leaders have been very consistently reminded of what it is they said while coming into office. And they have also taken the step of reporting back, this is what we're doing. We've changed the leadership of these parastatals and this and that. There will be some that will ask, is this now the anti-corruption fight being used for political tools? Like, are we settling political scores? Perhaps. That needs to be looked into. But what we can see is that the promises that were put up at the point of coming into office are being held up, and there's a society pushing back to say, please report back. What have you done so far? If that is done consistently, perhaps we'll see some changes, some measures.
No doubt, Paul, and also that resonates with a lot of Nigerians as well as other countries watching. If you remember, the present government in Nigeria came on the back of two key things: fighting corruption and fixing the security challenges that Nigerians have been, battling at the moment. Professor Naituli, you raised some key points there, mentioning great Africans. I wanted us to look at some of those key things that they started off with and see if, present-day leaders have been able to continue from where they stopped, because Paul just reminded us that what is needed is for them to have started, in as much as little, but just start off and also brief the people about your policies and programs that they can quickly, buy in, as we've seen with the late John Magufuli when he came on the saddle. We saw him digging deep. If it warranted him getting into the dustbins, into the dirt, it wasn't for the cameras. He meant it, and he was doing all of that until he was no more. Yeah, but are there things that leaders of today, Nigeria and a couple of other places, Kenya, can do to get the countries, working again?
There are things citizens can do. I don't know about the leaders, because Tanzania has demonstrated that it has staying power in fighting corruption and following a positive policy, because Nyerere entrenched nationalism in Tanzania. So when the Tanzania peered off and Jakaya's Muricho Kikwete, Magufuli was able to return it to the path, move it away from corruption, because he had the Nyerere shoulder to stand on. But there are countries which unfortunately were started by corrupt leaders. Those countries have established a corruption culture. The only way now to remove that is if the citizens' consciousness were to rise, because remember, they use the corruption money during elections. That is the same as somebody steals your cows, then brings you milk from those cows which were yours with the store, and you celebrate them. So when the citizens reject the milk from their cows and insist bring us cows, we also know how to milk, that way, then there can be a sustained war on corruption. So it's very hard in some countries to do it, because they were started the wrong way. They were started by those people I just explained. The people who psychologically seemed to have self-hatred. That's why they were supporting the Europeans. And then they inherited their countries from Europeans. Those countries is very difficult to change. I can't see change, for example, in Kenya, changing our culture right now. The corruption culture is just about impossible. We have actually accepted it as normal because we can't do anything about this. So there are these countries that nothing can be done. But you can see South Africa moved into corruption practices under Zuma And the current president has arrested that situation back, and the people are being held accountable. So there are few countries, he mentioned Angola is one of them. There are few countries that you can actually address this issue and put them on a trajectory away from mega official corruption, because the corruption that is banned is actually official corruption, governmental sanctioned corruption. That is what is killing the African countries. So there are those countries which did not start in the wrong side, which established their culture, and there are countries which simply were started by the wrong people. And those countries will have a long way to go before they can return to the path of progress, path of patriotism, and the path of nationalism.
You see, Paul, Professor Naituli has taken us back to how we started this conversation, and it is something that truly worries any African, seeing that we have already taken corruption as a culture, to the extent that in villages, hamlets, and cities across religious and political lines, people who have their fingers deep in corruption are those the people, respect, deify and extol, thinking that these are the people to follow. But, some countries of the world, especially in Far East Asia, have come to put the death penalty for corrupt people. And some people have been asking, Paul, if this is something that Africa should also be looking into at the moment to steer the ship back on course.
Thank you, Sulaiman. Let me begin by saying that there is a very, very close link between corruption and human rights. And to the extent that there are some of us who are considering that the discussion is corruption actually violating particular rights? And should we strengthen that conversation? But as we talk about human rights, it's the argument that most of us embrace is that those who still have the death penalty on the books, in the laws of the country, should seriously work towards doing away with it. And for very many different reasons, but that takes us into the conversation on human rights at its core. And that said, we wouldn't find, if we struggled very hard, we wouldn't find evidence that the death penalty has helped in the reduction of corruption in a country. I mean, that we don't have as data. So it's a very problematic area to get into the conversation of the role of the death penalty. And the conversation right now is unequivocally to argue against the death penalty. And countries like, we still have countries, even in Africa, that still have the death penalty in the books, Botswana and others, and the argument is to get rid of it. And in terms of what is really the solution, it is difficult to point to one or even 2 or 3 or 10 key issues and say, if you do these 10 things, you'll get rid of corruption in a country. It is a system. So a number of things need to be done in a systematic way and consistently over a long time to be able to create any dents. So it's difficult to pull out one and say, get the right laws and you have a dent in the anti-corruption fight, or get the right institutions, or just the right leaders. I mean, we keep throwing up what seems to be key, but it's really a system. And all the different moving parts need to come in place properly. Perhaps some things need to come before others. I will agree with Professor Naituli that leadership is high up there. Have the right leadership, and that right leadership needs to do the right things consistently. If the laws are not working well, fix the laws, they create the right institutions, equip the institutions, they do their jobs. And there are very many different institutions, anti-corruption institutions, working with the different parts of the judiciary, the accountants, the auditor generals, and election systems, and all the relevant systems. So it's difficult to point out one thing.
Okay, Professor Naituli, I saw you wanted to also comment on that, so let me cede that to you quickly.
Yeah, I want to agree with them that I think one single thing that can do a mortal blow to corruption is simply having proper leadership. That is what we are lacking. Leadership, you see, a leader can only give to his community commitment and love. And that means a leader must have proper grounding, proper morals, must get that love from his own parents in order to be able to serve society completely without having to buy people, without having to buy parliament to pass wrong laws, etc. So leadership is the key here. We get it right on leadership, everything else falls in place. That is where we have failed. We have not been able to get it right on leadership. We are still under colonial rule, basically, as it were, because we exchanged the Europeans with the collaborators. And those collaborators hate themselves and they hate their countries and their fellow countrymen at the same time. So what he said, but there's the other thing also, the education of the citizens. The citizens to understand that their vote can actually make a difference in situations where it can work like it has worked in Ghana. Ghana is in the process of breaking through from the African poverty and the African corruption because they have made peace with the transfer of power. So their leaders are no longer committing corruption crimes. They are willing to see the power even defeated in a free and fair election. So what we need to look at in Africa to get out of this madness is simply to get good leaders. Now that will take time because it needs educated citizenry. It's not going to happen by accident. It will require a lot of work from all those anti-corruption forces, the civil society, and of course, from people like us in the universities, and move the society away from the thieves who come to buy elections to people generally who may just come from nowhere, like in Obama, get deported in, and then start dealing with the money stuff.
Let's take a moment, Paul, Banoba, and Professor Naituli. When we come back, we'll close on those possible things that should be done. And of course, we'll also look at that very big angle, which you also talked about concerning those collaborators. Join us again. Welcome back. It's our home stretch here on Village Square, Africa. And of course, we're looking at the fight against corruption on the African continent. Nigeria has, is ranked 143rd on the Global Corruption Index and is arguably the most blessed country in Africa and even the world. Now, sadly, there are no reflections of the abundance of Nigeria's resources and the daily lives of its people. Basic amenities are still absent, and the country's human capital index is strongly into rise, no thanks to financial misappropriation and mismanagement of funds. Now, in Nigeria, the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission, that's the EFCC, was established in 2003 for the sole aim of battling corruption. While it has recorded successes, some Nigerians feel it has become a tool for political witch hunt. Now, I'm not being joined by Daniel Bwala. He joins me from the United Kingdom. And of course, Paul Banoba is still with me in Berlin. And somehow, we lost the connection to Professor Naituli. And I'm hoping, we have that conversation again, Professor Naituli. Paul and Daniel, good to have both of you. Let me start with you, Daniel. I've been having this fantastic conversation with Professor Naituli and Paul, looking at corruption across the continent. You are a Nigerian. And the anti-graft agency, the EFCC, has been in existence for 18 years. And Nigeria has two of them, the ICPC for 21 years. Do you think both of these agencies have lived up to the promise?
Thank you for having me, and good evening to your viewers. To answer the question, one will have to look at the context in which the question is raised, and then from the perspective from which people look at it. But in a generic sense, it is said that corruption is as old as power itself, and also it is as new and current as the morning headline news. That there is corruption everywhere in the world. In the Western world, you find corruption, but it is minimized to a large extent. But for example, let me give you a perspective, Suleiman. In Africa, during this pandemic alone, there are allegations of corruption involving coronavirus relief in about 7 countries in Africa. You have Zimbabwe, Somalia, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and the rest. And there was an interesting analysis that was done about corruption in developing countries. And they said that about $1.26 trillion per year is lost to corruption, theft, and tax evasion. And that this amount is enough to lift about 1.4 billion people above poverty line for 6 years. There is also a research by Afrobarometer. It's a survey that was done in about 18 African countries between 2010 and then 2019 and 2020 to look at the perception of people, just like the question you're asking, as to whether or not corruption is being fought frontally and whether corruption is resisting every attempt. And it will interest you to know, Suleiman, that the findings in Afrobarometer survey shows that there is a consensus in Africa, all African countries, about 6 areas in which corruption has resisted every attempt to stem it out. Just like the way when you have a stubborn malaria, you will see that you will have to take a higher dose of anti-malaria injection to be able to deal with it. So it's like every time an anti-corruption medicine is administered, there seems to be a certain degree of resistance over time in Africa. Now, there is a consensus finding in that research about areas in African countries where corruption are prevalent, and that irrespective of regimes and people coming to take over and whatever the intentions of every administration is, there seems to be a degree of resistance. They said number one is the police. A general consensus that in the police in Africa, there is a higher degree of corruption. And then they talked about the parliament. Like in Nigeria, you have the National Assembly, which consists of the Senate and House of Representatives. And since 1999 till date, if I tell you, Mr. Suleiman, that there was a time until, of course, 2015 and 2019, the president of Nigeria tried his best to resist this attempt that every bill that is sent to the National Assembly must be accompanied with some Ghana must go before it will sail through. And how that when National Assembly members are exercising their oversight functions, they commercialize these screening processes, including appointment of certain ministers. So the parliament is also there. Then they talk about civil service. And the survey say a greater number of people in the civil service in Africa are so deeply entrenched in corruption that institutionalizing change is often resisted. And then there is the part of the legal system, which of course has to do with courts and administration of justice. Then, of course, you have the tax office. In Nigeria, FIRS recently, you remember when EFCC did some investigation, you'll find how corruption, was discovered there. And interestingly, number six of all, they said is the presidency. That corruption also resides and operates in the presidency throughout the African countries.
It's amazing. That's a big shock. And you were not here when Paul and Professor Naituli said that it's prevalent and you can find it across sector to the extent that they describe it as more like a culture. Paul, listening to Daniel, do you think Africa's corruption problems are as a result of weak institutions or the nature of the individuals in key positions?
Thank you, Sulaiman. I would agree with Daniel on quite a number of elements that he's raised. And but specifically with regard to, is this at individual level or is it at institutional level? There are two things to that. The first is that these institutions are occupied by individuals. So there's a sense in which we need to look at these two together. But where the institutions have the right setup, the extent to which the individuals can misbehave and get away with it is substantially reduced. What do I mean? If the institution is standing on the right law, it's very well set up, and it is resourced, and it is working with a network of other relevant institutions, it simply means that if Paul comes in and Paul as an individual is the wrong person, the corrupt person, and is trying to create a network of like-minded wrong people, the laws will be able to effectively prevent Paul from misbehaving. And should he manage to misbehave, the same laws or relevant laws will be able to help bring Paul to book. So there is a connection between the individuals and the institutions, but we begin at having the right institutions standing on the right laws and being equipped with the right capacities to do the various jobs. And they need to have their relative institutions doing the same thing. What you're mentioning in Nigeria with a number of anti-corruption institutions, these need to come together. And there's effort, as we know, there's effort in Nigeria to bring the anti-corruption fight together, networked through the PACAC. And these kinds of initiatives need to be strengthened, and so that we can see more of this.
Well, I think, Daniel, I don't know if you followed the big news in Nigeria, and it has to do with the comment from one of the senior lawyers who's a governor in the southwestern state of Ondo, where he said that Nigerians should be thinking of having a unicameral legislation, and everything, he said, is tied to, reducing corruption and, wastages. And he was also speaking to people from the parliament, National Assembly. Do you think Nigeria has enough, muscle in the fight against corruption, listening to leaders like the governor of the southwestern state of Ondo?
Well, I'm sure the governor spoke to the parliament when they went for constitutional review exercise, and I can say that because I'm a consultant and we are the ones that worked on these draft bills. But his comment was also interpreted from the political standpoint, and I'll tell you why. First of all, Nigeria is making the effort to fight against corruption, as you can see from leadership to leadership. When Magu was there, he did extensively well in his fight. And then, of course, the new person took over and is trying his best. But that is not to say that they have done enough or that there are no one or two things that can be pointed out. But to relate to the question you raised about the governor, people believe that, first of all, about unicameral and bicameral, I don't have a problem whether it becomes unicameral, because the only difference between the Senate and the House of Representatives is just the confirmation that the Senate does. All other functions, they do that together. So it will be an interesting idea if they look at that. But people say that what he said was a reaction because the National Assembly, as you may well know, last year did a constitutional review that amended Section 121 sub 3 of the Constitution that now has granted fiscal autonomy to the states' assemblies and the judiciary. And the governors did not like that because granting autonomy to them, it would deepen democracy and then lessen the control of the governors. And that has been the battle that the governors have had with the presidency. And National Assembly maintained the same position. If you recall recently, the Senate president was quoted to have told the governors, when the Southwest governors issued a directive, he said they should rather focus on how to implement what has been established as a law in the Constitution. So he made a good point, valid point, but he made it out of a reaction to the position that the National Assembly has maintained about the states. Now, I want to tell you, Mr. Suleiman, with the greatest respect, and that's my view, that lately I did an extensive research on corruption and good governance in Nigeria. And my findings are quite, staggering, that more than 60 to 70% of governance problems that we complain about in Nigeria, they lie in states. As we speak today, corruption is deeply entrenched without check in the states of the Federation. There is no accountability. Nobody can have the audacity, whether by way of the judiciary or the House of Assembly of a state, to call the governor or any other person in the state to book. Now, anytime a decision is taken at the national level, let's say, for example, the EFCC arrests Accountant General of a state or commissioner, the next thing the governor does is to politicize the whole process. So, and then you also have among the anti-graft body a complaint that their bid to fight the corruption is selective. That means if you're in good books of the government does not beam its light against you, even if you are alleged to be involved in corrupt practices. But the minute you go against the government, then that is when they turn the lights on you. And the survey I told you about earlier today, part of the consensus that they had, sampling opinion from individuals across Africa, is that anytime there is an outcry by the people to speak against government or corrupt people, there is always a punishment on the other side. So that is part of the major challenge we have in Africa, that just like my colleague said, Prof said, in terms of institution or individual, you strengthen the institution, the angels try to destroy the institution. And then by the time you come to the individuals, however strong they are, if the institutions are not correct, then it becomes difficult. So while we make progress in the fight against corruption in Africa, but generally speaking, there is a lot that needs to be done in Africa, because it's like we're taking one step forward and two steps backwards.
Paul, it was you who said that if the fight is actually genuine, then we're headed for some form of progress and not about witch hunting. Listening to Daniel, I think the issue here now is, as we coast home, let's talk about even the individuals, because I realize that some of the key things that you highlighted, Paul, is that the individuals make up the institution. Without that individual, there's no institution. For instance, public sector corruption, civil service corruption in Africa. Sometimes the civil servant thinks that his acts are not corrupt in nature. He thinks that it is the political leader that is corrupt. Make this more clear so that those on the continent can also understand how much of contribution they are making in plunging and causing pain to people on the continent.
Yeah, thanks, Suleiman. I think in terms of individuals, we might want to make a distinction with which individuals. So the individual at the helm, the higher you go, if we're talking about the presidency, we're talking about really the seniority of the leadership of the country, higher up there, the individual is more or less enshrined in an institution. So the president is an institution in itself. And that makes it a bit of a difference from Paul down here in an office, in a public office. So the governor that Daniel is talking about is a very powerful office. So the individual occupying that office has a slightly different perspective from somebody lower down. But in terms of the roles of different individuals as we stand, I mean, perhaps the best way to illustrate that is going back to say the leadership is supposedly doing a job on our behalf as citizens, which is called, they're the agents, we're the principals, as citizens, we're entrusting them to do this job. And the idea is that because we have entrusted these leaders to do this job, we can task them with accountability. What have you done? And they should actually be able to tell us. Now, if you go back to where Professor Naituli started by saying the entire society is corrupt and entrenched, then even us, the citizens who are supposed to ask the leaders for accountability, if the entire society has accepted corruption as a norm, and there is no outcry, and it's or we've seen that the outcries lead nowhere, year after year after year, and we settle, that really affects society badly. So we still have a job, those of us in promoting good governance, fighting against corruption, Daniel, yourself, to ensure that we do not get to that point of surrender, that citizens actually still believe the right thing needs to be done, and the younger generation needs to be equipped the right way, that when they do get into these offices, it is not, let me also pull in my direction. And I have hope, and I think we need to have this hope. We need to move forward knowing that this fight can be won. We wouldn't just give it up.
No doubt, it is a hope that that propels us to having this conversation. Quickly, Daniel, before we leave you, you're a lawyer. How can the judiciary help, if we can do this in a minute? How can the judiciary help in this all-important fight against corruption?
Well, from the Nigerian perspective, the first thing that we clamored for was fiscal autonomy, which has been granted to the judiciary at the federal level, so they can dispense justice without having to go to the executive cap in hand. We are pushing for that in the states. If you know, throughout Nigeria for over 2 months now, the judiciary, they are on strike because the governors refuse to agree to the fiscal autonomy implementation. So fiscal autonomy will help the judiciary in the fight against corruption. And then number 2, accountability. Once they're able to do self-cleansing on their own part, they will be able to dispense justice without recourse to corrupt practices. And maybe at a better time, we'll talk about the role that lawyers are playing, which has not been helping the fight against corruption in Africa.
Well, trust me, no doubt, Daniel. Paul has already pushed it to all of us. It's a conversation, from time to time we should be having. Of course, the discourse on corruption in Africa never ends, as it's a daily occurrence that affects every African. However, it's a fine place to stop today, as we hope to continue this some other time. And hopefully Africa would have been a step better by then. Many thanks for being such nice company. Daniel Bwala in the UK, Professor Gitile Naituli, and of course Paul Banoba joining us from Berlin. Many thanks to you all today. I'm Sulaiman. I'll be back again tomorrow. Bye-bye.